Thanks, Janet. My name is Anastasia, and as has been mentioned, I'm an environmental lawyer. I took a long career path to get to be an environmental lawyer. I started out as an environmental economist and an academic. I did all of my drinking in pubs in St. John's, Newfoundland. Came back to Ontario and went back to law school after having been an economist for several years. And my interest in moving from an environmental economist to an environmental lawyer is all about how the laws and the policies work. And are they working in a way that meets the standards that they've set? So I really like to plan. And I don't know if any of you are personal or professional planners, but I actually get quite a bit of joy out of planning a really good vacation, getting a spreadsheet, looking up all the places I want to go, and making it all sort of in advance. And I'm actually embarrassingly so into planning that when my mother died, I made a plan for grieving. I did a bunch of research, and I set out a plan. And just vacations, grieving, things don't go according to plan. But I firmly believe that having a plan, having a direction, knowing where you want to go, having some flexibility in your plan means that you'll probably be more successful than if you don't plan at all. My passion for planning has probably fed my passion for environmental assessment law, all very exciting topics. So I do a lot of work on environmental assessment law, and in Ontario, the legal standard we've set for ourselves in the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act is betterment. Betterment for the people of Ontario by how we plan, how we conserve and protect our natural environment. I think betterment's a really great standard to have. Unfortunately, things don't go according to plan. So if we look at Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act, the first thing I'll let you know about that is it only applies to public projects and projects that are on public lands. So if there's a project by a government or a government agency, it automatically would be subject to environmental assessment. If there's a project that's happening on crown lands or bushlands, which I call public lands, it would be subject to an environmental assessment. So municipal sewage and waterworks, yes, environmental assessment. A residential 200-unit new subdivision, no environmental assessment. The second thing is that over time, there's been a lot of streamlining of our processes so that they can happen in quicker and simpler ways. And one of the ways that we streamline environmental assessments is to have an overarching set of rules called a class environmental assessment that describes how these projects will be handled. And through some of them in a very non-transparent way, the criteria that go into deciding how much public engagement will happen are very unclear or unavailable. When I was mentioning earlier, something like a sewage project or a drinking water project, those all fall under the municipal engineer's class environmental assessment. And that set of rules, the municipal engineer's class environmental assessment, is treated as proprietary. If you want to be able to read that document, you need to buy it. The third thing is that some environmental assessments are scoped. They're scoped in ways that mean you might not assess the entire footprint of a project all at once. You can scope it down and only look at one particular alternative instead of all the alternatives, or scope it down and look at just one piece of a project, maybe just an access road or just a transmission line. The fourth problem that I'll identify with our environmental assessment process in Ontario is that sometimes there's no application of environmental assessment at all. For example, mines. Although the development of mine often happens on public lands, and Ontario is the biggest mining jurisdiction in Canada, we are the only province or territory that does not require an environmental assessment of our mining projects. And the Victor Diamond Mine that Janet talked to you about, there was no provincial environmental assessment done. There was a federal environmental assessment, but tonight I'm just talking to you about the provincial system. The fifth thing is when we look at cumulative impacts, if we have a number of projects that are going to happen within one watershed, it makes intuitive sense to me to think about how they all work together. What will be the impact of all of these projects all together? And our Environmental Assessment Act in Ontario is silent. There is no requirement to do cumulative effects. The sixth thing, although our Ontario Environmental Assessment Act specifically says that it would apply, as I was saying, to public projects, it also could apply to public policies, proposals, and plans. So we could step back and say, we're thinking about doing a whole bunch of mining in an ecosystem feature that's never been mined before. Maybe we should have a strategy about how we'll roll forward with that type of environmental assessment. Referred to as a strategic environmental assessment or a regional strategic environmental assessment, it's enabled by our law. Very clear that it could come under that. And what we've seen happen is that systematically over the last number of years, I'd say between 8 years, last 8 years, every time there's a new piece of legislation that has some sort of plan or policy or program in it, the government has explicitly excluded it from being subject to environmental assessment at all. And that's 6 problems I've identified. There's more, but I'll stop with that. I think I may have convinced you that our environmental assessment program in Ontario is broken. And I think now's the time to fix it. I don't know if you've heard this saying before, when's the best time to plant a tree? 25 years ago. What's the next best time to plant a tree? Today. So I think about planning that way. I think we can learn a lot from how we planned 25 years ago when we didn't take into account cumulative impacts, when we took up all of our natural systems and covered them with concrete and roofs and roads. We can learn from that. We can do it in a different way. And in doing so, I think that we can have better futures. We can reach this idea of betterment. We could work with First Nation communities that will be impacted. We can learn from the scientists who understand how best to safeguard people and wildlife. We can partner with government and industry. We can have a forward-looking vision. And we can reinvigorate our environmental assessment program in Ontario so that that legal standard of betterment can be achieved. So how do we do that? Focusing specifically on this area, the Ring of Fire, Janet was describing all of the important features of that area in terms of its value as an ecosystem. It's also the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Nation. It's important. And it's important enough that in 2010, the Ontario legislature passed an act called the Far North Act that committed the government to protecting half of it and sustainably developing the other half. And in assessing how they might do that, there really is no plan. So the recommendations in this report that I co-authored with a colleague at the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, we made 4 recommendations. One, we said, look at the big picture and require that there be strategic environmental assessment or a regional strategic environmental assessment before the individual projects start to proceed. The second is we thought it would be important to gather information so we understand the ecosystem and kind of baseline the understanding of the ecosystem health now so that we can figure out how it's changing over time. The third thing is to transform how we plan in a new way. The Far North Act enables something called the Far North Land Use Strategy. That could be a strategic document that looks very different than the way we've done our planning in the South, and we could learn from that and do a better job. And finally, we recommend that we could bring together all of the environmental planning processes that we have under one roof and do it as a sort of consolidated process. We have the Clean Water Act, we have our Environmental Assessment Act, we have the Mining Act, we have the Far North Act. Why don't we look at all of those, scope all of that jurisdiction into one process, which are Wildlands League and our colleagues at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada have been saying could be done in regional strategic environmental assessment. The dialogue has evolved since we wrote this report in 2014. What happens next is up to political will. And I suggest that we are political will, and I encourage you all to